The marble gods of Greece still smile, but their smiles were never pure. They were carved by hands that trembled between worship and hunger, by men who built temples to reason while drowning in the chaos of their own appetites. Beneath the sunlit columns of Athens and the silver-lit courtyards of Corinth, a different kind of empire was rising, not of politics or philosophy, but of flesh. To the poets and the priests, desire was divine. To the victims, it was a sentence written in the language of pain. Every festival, every ritual, every offering carried a secret price. A body, a scream, a silence that no historian could ever translate without feeling the burn of shame. They called it love, but it was never love. It was ritual disguised as affection, devotion turned into exploitation, a worship that fed not the gods but the powerful men who claimed to speak for them. In the great temple of Aphrodite, 1,000 flames flickered in the dark, each one marking a girl whose name the world forgot. She stood like an offering sculpted in perfume and fear, surrounded by laughter that did not belong to her. Somewhere beyond the marble walls, philosophers debated virtue, poets recited odes to beauty, and sculptors immortalized perfection, while the living flesh that inspired them was stripped of all dignity. This was the contradiction of Greece. The civilization that taught the world the meaning of beauty also taught it how to hide its cruelty behind marble and myth. Its gods demanded pleasure as prayer. Its heroes committed horrors in the name of enlightenment, and its philosophers praised freedom while keeping others in chains. This is the untold Greece. Not the land of thinkers and warriors, but the cradle of sins dressed as civilization. In the heart of ancient Corinth, where the sea winds carried both the scent of salt and incense, the temple of Aphrodite stood like a gleaming crown over the city. To outsiders, it was a monument to beauty, love, and divine femininity. But to those who lived in its shadow, it was a prison built in marble, a place where faith and flesh were traded with equal indifference. From a distance, the temple looked serene, its columns painted in hues of rose and ivory, its terraces alive with laughter and music. Yet as night fell and the torches were lit, that laughter took on another meaning, the kind that hides beneath the trembling breath of the powerless. For the goddess of love demanded her offerings not in prayers, but in bodies. The ritual began at dawn, when the girls of the temple were washed, perfumed, and adorned. They were chosen not for their devotion, but for their beauty. Some were daughters sold by desperate fathers to erase debt. Others were slaves gifted by merchants seeking divine favor. A few believed the stories, that serving Aphrodite would bring them glory in the afterlife, until they stood before the altar and understood what service truly meant. The priests would recite hymns as they tied gold chains around their wrists and ankles, symbols of holy devotion, though every girl knew the weight of those chains was not sacred but carnal. By evening, the temple would open its gates to men who came from distant lands, soldiers, sailors, nobles, all eager to touch what was divine. They offered coins, jewels, or even livestock to the priest, believing their lust a form of worship. The men called it communion, the priests called it ritual. But for the girls, it was desecration wrapped in incense and piety. They were taught to smile through their tears, to move as if possessed by the goddess herself, to whisper blessings into the ears of strangers who could not remember their names. The night would end with the girls kneeling before Aphrodite's statue, a cold, unblinking witness of marble lips and stone eyes. They would pray for forgiveness, though they were told it was they who should offer it. And when dawn came again, they would rise from their beds, wash away the evidence, and prepare for another day of devotion that never reached heaven. One story, preserved in the writings of an obscure historian, tells of a young woman known only as Kalyanara, the beautiful one of victory. She had been brought to the temple at 14, sold by her father after a bad harvest. At first, she believed the priest's words, that she was chosen by the goddess herself, destined to bring love to men as divine service. But on her first night, when a merchant from Crete forced himself upon her under the statue of Aphrodite, she realized there was no divinity here, only men cloaked in the excuse of religion. For years she endured, her face becoming one of the temple's prized attractions, her name whispered across ports as if she were a myth. Yet with every offering she felt herself fading, her body a relic being consumed by the very faith it was meant to serve. On the final night of her life, legend says, Kalyanara walked barefoot into the sea beneath the temple hill. The waves glowed under the moonlight like molten silver. Witnesses claimed she prayed aloud, not to Aphrodite, but to the stars, asking that no girl ever be born into her fate again. The next morning, her body washed ashore, wrapped in seaweed like a funerary shroud. The priests called it blasphemy, but the sailors who found her left offerings at the shore for years to come. Her name disappeared from the temple records, erased like a stain. But whispers of her sacrifice lingered, that perhaps, for one moment, the goddess herself looked down and wept. Behind every ritual of sacred love, there was a quiet machinery of power. The temple's wealth came not from faith, but from the commerce of bodies. Coins poured in like a second tide, enough to build marble stairways, to fund the city's festivals, to buy silence. Corinth became infamous not for its art or architecture, but for its holy courtesans. Travelers wrote of them as exotic wonders, confusing submission with grace. Even philosophers, men who debated ethics and virtue, visited the temple in secret, speaking of enlightenment while indulging in the very acts they condemned. It was not just lust, it was ownership, of the female form, of purity itself, of belief twisted into pleasure. The irony of Greek civilization was that it worshipped beauty, but never questioned the cost of possessing it. To them, the body was the vessel of the divine, yet it was also the easiest thing to corrupt. The same culture that produced sculptures of gods and goddesses in perfect harmony also produced rituals that desecrated those ideals nightly. Aphrodite's priests would claim the goddess smiled upon those who gave themselves fully, body and soul. But if the goddess had truly smiled, the echoes of those cries would not still haunt the stones. The marble floors of her temple had been washed for centuries, yet beneath every layer of polish, the memory of suffering clung like a ghostly fingerprint. And so the temple of Aphrodite stood, not as a shrine to love, but as a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of an empire that worshipped its own desires. To this day, historians argue whether sacred prostitution in Corinth was as widespread as the ancient writers described. But the ruins tell their own story, of rooms too small for prayer, of altars placed beside beds, of coins buried in the cracks of the floor as if to pay for absolution. Some say the temple's collapse was a punishment from the gods. Others believe it was the inevitable result of a civilization that mistook indulgence for divinity. Whatever the truth, the marble dust that covers the hill still carries the scent of rose oil and salt, the perfume of those forgotten women who prayed not for love, but for release, in the quiet corridors of Athens. Behind the marble courtyards where philosophers walked and poets composed their verses, there existed a world that pulsed with music, wine, and whispered promises. It was called the Symposium, a gathering that outwardly appeared as the crown jewel of Greek intellect, the meeting place of the enlightened. Here men debated the mysteries of the soul, the nature of virtue, and the perfection of beauty. Yet beneath this veil of philosophy was a theater of possession, a place where the fragile line between mentorship and desire was constantly crossed and redrawn. The Symposium was the beating heart of Greek aristocracy, but its rhythm was set by lust, and its silence held the screams that no one dared to name. At dusk, the guests would arrive draped in linen robes scented with myrrh. The air thickened with the fragrance of crushed grapes and burning sandalwood as young slaves poured wine into bronze cups engraved with the faces of gods who themselves had known corruption. Music drifted from the corners, soft, trembling notes played by boys barely old enough to understand the songs they were forced to perform. The men reclined on couches, discussing rhetoric, politics, and poetry, while their hands strayed toward the trembling bodies that served them. To outsiders, it looked like camaraderie. To those within, it was domination disguised as affection. Each movement, each gesture, each word was part of an ancient choreography, one that glorified control and called it education. The Greeks gave this relationship a name that sounded noble, paiderastia, the love of boys. They claimed it was an exchange of intellect, where an older man, the Erastes, would mentor a youth, the Eromenos, teaching him philosophy, warfare, and art. Yet history, when stripped of its poetic phrasing, reveals a darker truth. The mentorship was often a mask, and beneath it lay desire both sanctified and unrestrained. The Eromenos was chosen for his beauty, his voice, the delicate curve of his face, his youth. He was to be molded, possessed, and shaped into the image his master found pleasing. The philosophers who wrote treatises on morality were often the same who defended these bonds as divine, claiming that the beauty of a boy mirrored the beauty of the gods. But the gods they spoke of were merciless reflections of their own hunger. Plato himself, in his Symposium, described love as the path to the divine, yet even he could not untangle purity from desire. The same dialogues that praised the soul's ascent were born in rooms where innocence was traded for philosophy. The boys, often from noble families seeking favor or advancement, were taught to accept this bond as their destiny. They were told that yielding was a form of respect, that submission was the price of wisdom. And when the act was over, when the lights dimmed and the guests dispersed, the boys were left alone, half disciples, half victims. Some went on to become philosophers themselves, carrying the scars of their initiation beneath the robes of scholars. Others vanished into anonymity, their stories dissolved into the wine-soaked floors of vanished villas. There is one tale, half legend, half record, of a boy named Nicandros, a student of a wealthy statesman who fancied himself both teacher and lover. Nicandros was 14 when he entered the household, eager to learn the art of oration. His master, proud of his intellect, invited him to the symposium to observe the customs of men. That night, as the torches flickered and laughter filled the chamber, Nicandros was asked to pour wine for the guests. Every eye followed him as he moved, the embodiment of youth and beauty. The statesman watched in silence as his friends praised the boy's grace, and before the night was over, he claimed him as his own. For years, Nicandros lived in the shadow of that affection, trained to speak and act as a man yet denied the innocence of his youth. When his master died, the boy, now a man, built no tomb, no epitaph. He disappeared into the countryside, and the records end there, as though history itself was too ashamed to follow. The symposium was not a place of corruption alone. It was a reflection of a civilization that revered intellect but feared equality. The men who ruled Athens could not bear the idea of women sharing their counsels, so they sought beauty elsewhere, in boys whose youth made them pliant and whose silence preserved the illusion of virtue. The same city that punished women for adultery celebrated men for the same acts when cloaked in the language of mentorship. And through this paradox, Greek culture immortalized an unspoken truth. Power, once mixed with desire, becomes its own religion. Every symposium was a temple to that unholy creed. Historians later tried to explain these customs as part of their time, a different morality, a different world. But morality is never truly of its time. It is only what power allows. The Greeks built their philosophies upon ideals of balance, moderation, and reason, yet they practiced none of these when it came to pleasure. Their gods, too, mirrored their contradictions. Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, was both protector and predator, seducing mortals under the guise of divinity. Ganymede, the cupbearer of the gods, was once a mortal boy taken by Zeus for his beauty, a myth so openly celebrated that it became the divine justification for earthly acts. When men in Athens reached for boys, they claimed they were imitating Zeus himself. The divine had become the excuse for the monstrous. And yet, there was tragedy beneath even this cruelty. Many of those boys grew into men who carried a quiet understanding of the world's hypocrisy. They learned that beauty was not a blessing, but a weapon, one that could wound even the one who possessed it. Some turned bitter, others philosophical. It is said that behind the eloquence of Greek philosophy lies the silent pain of those who once served as its inspiration, voices that could never speak in the halls of power, yet shaped the words spoken there. The wine that filled those golden cups tasted of honey and iron, and in its reflection one could glimpse the soul of a civilization that could not distinguish enlightenment from indulgence. Thus the symposium, the celebrated cradle of intellect, was also the chamber of exploitation. Its marble floors were polished with the footprints of poets, generals, and thinkers. Yet beneath every polished surface lay the same secret, that power desired innocence, and knowledge often began with violation. To this day, the ruins of such houses lie silent under the Greek sun, their mosaics shattered, their frescoes faded. But if you stand there at dusk, when the wind passes through the broken walls, it still carries the echo of music and laughter, the haunting sound of a civilization that called itself enlightened while feeding its heart to the dark. When the sun set over Athens and the air thickened with the perfume of ripened grapes, a transformation began to stir across the land. It started as a murmur in the countryside, the rhythm of drums echoing from the hills, the sound of flutes winding through the olive groves like a serpent. The people called it Dionysia, the sacred festival of the god of wine, madness, and rebirth. But to those who witnessed it, it was something far more primal, a ritual that stripped away reason, unbound desire, and set the city trembling in both awe and terror. For a few nights each year, the Greeks, the same people who worshipped order, philosophy, and restraint, surrendered to chaos. And in that surrender, the mask of civilization cracked, revealing the wild hunger that lay beneath. The streets overflowed with worshippers clad in ivy crowns and animal skins, their faces painted with ash and pigment, their voices raised in a chorus of delirium. The air pulsed with the beat of drums, the wailing of flutes, and the rhythmic stamping of feet that shook the ground like an ancient heartbeat. Men and women danced until their bodies gleamed with sweat, eyes rolled back in ecstasy, mouths whispering the name of Dionysus as if invoking a fever. Wine poured freely from amphorae, spilling into the dust like blood from a wound. And under the moon's cold light, the festival crossed from celebration into something darker, a mass forgetting of self, where every boundary dissolved, and even the gods seemed to lose control of their creations. Among the worshippers were the Maenads, women said to be possessed by the spirit of Dionysus himself. They roamed the hills in frenzy, their hair unbound, their garments torn, their hands clutching thursey, staffs wound with ivy and tipped with pine cones. To the poets, they were symbols of divine madness. To those who saw them, they were visions of terror and liberation entwined. It was said that in their ecstasy, they tore apart wild animals with their bare hands, believing the blood they spilled was a form of communion with the god. Some accounts claimed they devoured the flesh raw, their mouths red beneath the starlight, their eyes wide with divine intoxication. To the Greeks, these stories were both warning and wonder, a reminder that the gods could grant freedom only through the annihilation of control. In the city, the festival took on another form: theater. The tragedies of Euripides and Aeschylus were performed before the crowds, their stories echoing the same tension between reason and madness that haunted the people themselves. On stage, kings fell, mothers killed, and mortals defied gods, while the audience wept and cheered, purging their own chaos through the illusion of art. But even this art was born of blood. The actors performed in honor of Dionysus, and each mask they wore was an offering to him, a surrender of identity, a ritual transformation. The line between play and possession blurred, and many claimed that during those nights the god himself walked among them, wearing the face of a man. Yet the true Dionysia happened far from the theaters, in secret groves and mountain caves where the faithful gathered in darkness. Torches burned low, casting trembling shadows over the faces of those who had come to abandon all restraint. There, beneath the ancient oaks, the rituals turned savage. Animals were sacrificed, wine mixed with their blood, and men and women joined in acts that defied both law and decency. To outsiders, it was debauchery. To the participants, it was transcendence. They believed that by losing themselves completely, by surrendering their minds and bodies to the god, they could glimpse immortality, the state beyond pain and fear. Some never returned from these nights, their bodies found in ravines or fields, their faces frozen in expressions that no mortal could interpret, perhaps ecstasy, perhaps horror. Historians later called these rites the mysteries of Dionysus, comparing them to the other secret cults of Greece, like those of Eleusis or Orpheus. But Dionysus's followers were not seekers of serenity or wisdom. They sought the violent rebirth that comes from destruction. They believed the soul could only be purified through chaos, that order itself was a lie built to cage the divine within. In their eyes, the god was not cruel, he was necessary, a reminder that pleasure and pain, creation and ruin are one and the same. It was this philosophy that made Dionysus both adored and feared, for he embodied what Greece tried hardest to deny, that beneath its marble cities and perfect proportions, it was still an animal searching for release. There was a legend whispered among the elders of Thebes about one festival that ended in tragedy so profound it changed how the city worshipped forever. A young nobleman, overcome with curiosity, disguised himself as a follower and joined the Maenads in the mountains. When the frenzy took hold, he tried to stop them from harming a captured deer, pleading with them to return to their senses. But the women, seeing a man intruding upon their divine madness, mistook him for a beast. In their trance they fell upon him and tore him apart, believing they were fulfilling the will of Dionysus. When the dawn came and their ecstasy faded, they found his body scattered among the rocks, his eyes staring up at the sky as if begging for mercy from a god who knew none. The city buried what remained of him in silence, and the name of the festival was never spoken again without fear. Such stories were not rare in Greece, they were warnings written in myth. The cult of Dionysus revealed what every civilization hides, that the pursuit of pleasure, once unchained, devours both the body and the soul. Yet the Greeks could never abandon him. They needed Dionysus as much as they needed Apollo, his opposite, the god of light, order, and reason. Without madness, reason had no meaning. Without the abyss, perfection had no edge. And so the festivals continued, year after year, century after century, each one a ritual reminder that no matter how refined a society becomes, its gods are always carved from the same primal hunger. When the Romans later adopted these rites, they renamed them Bacchanalia and tried to hide their savagery behind law. But even they could not contain what the Greeks had unleashed. The legacy of Dionysus lived on, in every forbidden celebration, every intoxicated crowd, every moment when humanity forgets itself in pursuit of something divine. To stand in the ruins of a Dionysian temple today is to feel the residue of that madness still lingering in the stone. The wind that moves through the columns seems to whisper, not of reason or beauty, but of surrender, the eternal call of a god who promised freedom and gave only the taste of oblivion. Behind the marble facades of Athens and Sparta, beyond the temples where hymns echoed to the gods of virtue, another Greece existed, unseen, unspoken, and yet indispensable to its greatness. Every column that touched the heavens, every ship that sailed across the glittering Aegean, every feast that filled the symposiums with laughter, rested on the bent backs of those who could not speak their pain. Greece was built not only by thinkers and heroes, but by slaves, men, women, and children, captured, traded, and broken in the name of civilization. To the masters, they were not human beings, but extensions of property, living tools whose silence was demanded by law. But beneath that silence lay a world of humiliation so constant that even the gods seemed deaf to it. The markets of Athens smelled of sweat, sea brine, and iron. There, under the blazing sun, bodies were displayed like livestock, their ages and features announced by men who called themselves merchants. A girl with Thracian eyes fetched more coin if she was young and unscarred. A boy from Asia Minor was prized if his face carried softness mistaken for beauty. The buyers came with gold and entitlement, examining the captives as if appraising statues, pressing fingers into flesh, lifting chins to study teeth and eyes. Contracts were signed not with dignity, but with the indifference of routine. Once the deal was sealed, the slaves were led away, some to kitchens, others to mines, but the most fortunate to the private chambers of noble houses where the true empire of shame began. Within these marble homes, the hierarchy of lust was as rigid as any battlefield formation. The masters believed their power divine, their will an extension of Zeus's authority. Women who had once sung songs of their homeland now served as concubines to men who called their degradation natural order. Young boys, chosen for their appearance, became attendants, trained to obey every gesture, every unspoken command. They were forced to pour wine, wash their masters, and sometimes lie beside them under the pretext of affection. Greek philosophers wrote endlessly about moderation, about the control of one's passions, yet behind closed doors they abandoned those very ideals. The same hands that carved the statues of gods caressing mortals were the hands that claimed ownership over the living. There was no sanctuary from this servitude, not even in the temples. In the sanctuaries of Apollo, Artemis, and even Demeter, slaves were employed as attendants, cleaners, and entertainers. Some were offered as gifts to the gods, though the offerings benefited only the priests. The Temple of Delphi, home to the oracle who spoke the will of Apollo, was built by forced labor. Men whose names were never recorded, though their sweat stained the very stones that still stand today. And in the household shrines, slaves were often forced to kneel before idols, not to pray for themselves but for their master's fortune, begging the gods to favor those who had stolen their freedom. Religion, like philosophy, became another tool of control, a means to sanctify cruelty. For the women of this hidden Greece, the body became both prison and punishment. Many were taken as spoils of war, Trojan, Persian, Egyptian, carried back as trophies of victory. They were stripped of their names, their languages, their right to say no. In Athenian households, a wife might rule over these enslaved women with as much cruelty as her husband, for even she, bound by the laws of men, found her only power in domination. The female slaves bathed their mistresses, raised their children, and at night endured the company of men who claimed divine right over their bodies. Their children, if born, were considered property, never acknowledged, often discarded. The poets called these women shadows of beauty, but their beauty was the curse that chained them. Among the men enslaved, there was a different kind of torment, the systematic erasure of identity. Male captives were often forced into labor or trained for pleasure, and some were mutilated to make them safe for noble households. Eunuchs, imported from the East, were prized for their docility and their inability to reproduce, as if the removal of their manhood erased their humanity. They served as servants, musicians, and guards of women's quarters, living in perpetual twilight between genders, between personhood and objecthood. And yet, many of these men became silent witnesses to the darkest rituals of Greek domestic life, seeing everything, remembering everything, but never allowed to speak. The greatest tragedy of this empire of shame was its silence, the absence of any voice from those who suffered. The chronicles of Greece are filled with the speeches of statesmen, the poems of lovers, the dialogues of philosophers, but none from the mouths of slaves. Their stories were carried only through rumor, through fragments of pottery etched with the trembling hand of someone who had stolen a moment of expression. Historians write of Greece's glory, its democracy, its art, but rarely of the cost. For every statue of marble perfection, there were countless unseen bodies that trembled under its weight. And yet, history remembers glimpses, small rebellions that flicker through time like dying candles. One account tells of a slave woman named Myrene in Sparta who, when her master struck her for breaking a jar, threw the shards back at his face, declaring that even broken clay has edges sharp enough to wound. She was executed the next morning, but her defiance became whispered legend among the enslaved. Another speaks of a man from Ephesus who poisoned his master's wine after years of humiliation, choosing death over submission. These stories, scattered and half-believed, are the heartbeat of a buried Greece, the Greece that bled so another might feast. By the time of Alexander's conquest, the Greek world had perfected the machinery of domination. Conquest fed slavery, slavery fed luxury, luxury fed corruption. The cycle became eternal, sanctified by law, protected by gods, and justified by philosophy. Even Aristotle, revered as a voice of reason, declared that some men were born to rule and others to serve. A truth of nature, he claimed, not injustice. Such reasoning allowed cruelty to survive as virtue. It transformed suffering into necessity, and necessity into pride. The Greek ideal of freedom, so often celebrated in myth and art, existed only for the few. The rest were ghosts that labored, loved, and died in silence. When the empires of Greece began to crumble and the philosophers fled their schools, the slaves were left behind among the ruins. Their chains rusted into the earth, their bones mixed with the marble dust of temples that no longer echoed with prayer. And though centuries have passed, their absence is still felt, a quiet void in history where names should have been. For every speech that praised democracy, for every ode that exalted beauty, there was a voice that was never heard, a face that was never remembered. The Greeks claimed to have invented humanity's highest virtues, but in the dark corners of their world they practiced its oldest sin, to turn one soul into the property of another. As the centuries passed, and the empire of marble began to crack beneath the weight of time, Greece's splendor slowly turned to myth. The temples that once echoed with hymns to Aphrodite and Dionysus fell silent, their altars overgrown with ivy and silence. The philosophers who had defended indulgence's divine intellect were replaced by new voices preaching purity and sin, and yet the echoes of the old world never vanished. The gods of lust and madness did not die, they changed shape, slipping quietly into the veins of Western civilization. In the shadows of Rome, in the cathedrals of medieval Europe, and in the whispers of modern desire, the same hunger endured, disciplined, denied, and yet never destroyed. The Greece that once glorified the body had left behind not freedom, but guilt, a sickness of the soul born from centuries of worshipping pleasure and then fearing it. When Rome inherited the legacy of Greece, it also inherited its contradictions. The Romans called their gods by new names, but the stories remained the same. Jupiter became Zeus, Venus became Aphrodite, and Bacchus took the place of Dionysus. The same myths of divine seduction, violation, and betrayal were retold as moral lessons, stripped of their original reverence and twisted into warnings. The Romans built their temples higher, their orgies grander, but even as they indulged, they began to sense the curse within the gift. They saw that what Greece had called beauty was also a mirror, reflecting their own decay. The poets of the empire, Ovid, Juvenal, Lucretius, wrote of love as a fever, a madness that consumed nations. And as Rome crumbled, its emperors drowning in luxury and blood, the philosophers finally began to whisper what Greece had always denied, that perhaps no civilization can survive when it worships its own desire. With the rise of Christianity, the ancient gods were condemned as demons, and the temples of pleasure became symbols of blasphemy. But in destroying the shrines, the new faith only inherited their shadows. The church that preached chastity still carried within its rituals the language of Greek sensuality, the incense, the candles, the hymns that trembled like whispers of seduction. The saints replaced the courtesans, the priests replaced the philosophers, but the longing remained, hidden beneath the robes of devotion. What had once been celebrated as divine love was now recast as sin, and the pendulum swung from indulgence to shame. Yet in both extremes, humanity remained trapped, first enslaved by desire, then by the fear of it. The gods of Greece had not vanished. They had become the guilt that haunted every prayer, the unspoken desire behind every act of repentance. In art, the ghosts of Greece never died. When Michelangelo sculpted the human form, he was resurrecting the same obsession that had driven the sculptors of Athens. When poets of the Renaissance wrote of forbidden love, they echoed Sappho and Euripides. Even the Enlightenment, that age of reason, looked back to Greece as its origin. Yet the philosophers who admired Plato's logic and Aristotle's ethics conveniently ignored the world of slavery, indulgence, and violence that had birthed those ideas. The irony was complete. The same civilization that had masked cruelty and beauty was now idolized as the foundation of virtue. Europe built its morality upon a myth, not realizing that beneath the marble foundations lay bones. But the truest legacy of ancient Greece was not its temples, nor its philosophy. It was its question. For beneath all its contradictions, Greece forced humanity to confront itself. What does it mean to be human when the divine and the depraved share the same face? The Greeks believed the gods were not separate from mankind but reflections of it, beautiful, flawed, and endlessly desiring. Zeus's infidelities, Aphrodite's jealousies, Dionysus's madness. These were not tales of deities alone, but mirrors of the people who invented them. Civilization, as Greece showed, does not erase the animal within. It only teaches it how to dance in marble halls. The same Greece that spoke of love as spiritual also used love as domination, proving that enlightenment and barbarism are not opposites but twins, born of the same hunger. Even now, the ruins of that world whisper lessons that few dare to hear. Walk among the broken columns of Corinth, and the wind still carries the scent of incense and sea salt, as if the ghosts of temple girls still linger in the dusk. Stand in the theater of Dionysus, and you can almost hear the crowd's roar as tragedy unfolds. Not a story of gods and kings, but of ordinary souls torn between pleasure and punishment. Look upon the statues in the museums, their perfect bodies frozen in eternal youth, and remember that those forms once belonged to the enslaved, the silenced, the forgotten. The beauty of Greece was always built on suffering, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that endures quietly, shaping art and thought for centuries after the bodies that bore it turned to dust. In the end, what Greece left the world was not wisdom, but longing. A longing for perfection that can never exist without cruelty, for beauty that must always hide its cost. The philosophers called it the pursuit of the ideal, but perhaps it was something darker, the inability to accept the imperfection of being human. The Greeks believed that the gods made mortals suffer because they envied them, because only in pain could beauty be eternal. And perhaps they were right. Every age since has carried a fragment of that philosophy. From Rome's decadence to the Church's repression, from the Renaissance's worship of form to the modern world's obsession with desire. The legacy of Greece is not merely in its art or reason, but in the unease that still haunts every civilization that dares to call itself enlightened. As the modern traveler stands before the Parthenon, gazing at its broken grandeur under the setting sun, it is easy to feel awe. But if one listens closely, beyond the chatter of tourists, beyond the sound of the city below, there is another voice, soft but relentless, rising from the stones. It is not the voice of gods or philosophers, but of the forgotten. The temple girls of Aphrodite, the boys of the symposium, the slaves who built the marble world they could never enter. Their silence has outlived every empire, their suffering immortalized not in texts but in absence. They are the true authors of the Greek tragedy, a tragedy not written on papyrus but carved into time itself. And their question remains unanswered: can beauty ever be innocent when it is born from pain? The ruins of Greece do not merely belong to history, they belong to every generation that repeats its mistakes. Each civilization that rises in the name of progress, each culture that masks cruelty and elegance, walks the same path beneath a different sky. Greece did not fall because it was weak, it fell because it could not bear the weight of its own contradictions. It dreamed of perfection and found corruption. It worshipped love and discovered power. It built gods in its own image and was destroyed by the reflection. And perhaps that is why, even now, we return to those broken stones, not to mourn what was lost, but to recognize ourselves in what remains.